Do you need help explaining anxiety to someone? Then jump in today's video, because today I'll be going through 7 tips to help you explain anxiety to someone in your life. Alright, so hey guys, my name is Diana Garcia. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, owner of a practice called Nurturing Minds Counseling. Alright, so let's jump in today's 7 tips. Okay, so to start off with, I just want to first talk about that it's actually pretty common and difficult to have this conversation at times as others, because a lot of times we might get concerned that other people might not understand, or maybe we've had situations in the past where it didn't go so well. And so I actually kind of hear this a lot with some of my clients where I'm not really sure how to go about explaining my anxiety to someone. And I actually hear the flip side a lot too when I work with clients who are with someone that struggles with anxiety. Same thing. I don't really know how to understand their anxiety. I don't get it. Right. So I think to first off, just talk about that. It's a pretty common struggle and question to have, like, how do you go about explaining your anxiety to someone, particularly someone who might not have anxiety? So maybe they don't really understand because they don't have firsthand experience. So my goal in today's video is to give you some tips to help you go through this process. You have to have an understanding of what your anxiety looks like. So this is the first tip in how you can explain your anxiety to someone else. Is you first have to get clear, what does your anxiety even look like to you? And maybe you've already done some of this work either personally or with a therapist, where you have a very clear understanding what type of anxiety do you have, right? Because there's different types of anxiety: generalized anxiety, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder. And these are all just terms, but they all fall under the umbrella of anxiety disorders. So the step one is for you to really get clear on what type of anxiety do you have. And you might have more than one, there might be some overlap, but getting clear on what does that even look like for you, right? What are the triggers for you? What are the thoughts that show up? What are the feelings that show up in the moment? The physical sensations? What do you do in those moments? How have you handled it before? What is your relationship with anxiety like now? Is it something you feel like you can handle well? You struggle at times, and that's okay too. But just getting clear on what does this anxiety look like for you in your life? How does it really show up in these different areas of your life? Because once you're clear on what this relationship with anxiety is like, then it's going to be much easier for you to explain that to someone else, whether it's a partner, a family member, a coworker, if that's who you're having this conversation with. Okay, so tip 2 is actually getting into the weeds of your anxiety with someone else. So once you have an understanding what that is, you actually want to get really clear with this person when you're explaining your anxiety. For instance, you want to get clear when we're thinking of anxiety, there's different components, right? There's the anxious thoughts that show up. So the thought component, like what do you think in the moment or before or after. Then there's a physical sensation. So that's a big part when we're talking about anxiety. It's like what gets triggered physically, right? Because our fight, flight, or freeze response has kicked in. Check out another video on that. But either way, your fight, flight, freeze response has kicked in. And so there's physical symptoms of anxiety. So you have to be clear on what those are so that you can explain that to someone else, as well as what do you do in the moment, right? So behaviorally, when your anxiety shows up, what is your tendency? Do you tend to avoid it? Do you want to get away as fast as possible? Have you figured out tools and techniques to help you deal with it or cope in the moment? So you want to get really clear with whoever you're talking about, like, this is what happens to me, step by step. This is the process that shows up for me. This is what happens in my head. I have thoughts. Let's say we're going to a social event. I have thoughts that people are judging me or looking at me weird, that I didn't pick the right outfit, that I'm not fitting in, that people think I'm awkward. And that causes me to start to have these physical symptoms of getting really hot and sweaty, and maybe thinking and starting like my heartbeat's beating faster. And then I start thinking, right? So back to the thoughts. Oh gosh, people know that I'm anxious. They can figure it out. They know that I'm struggling here, which makes me even weirder in their eyes. And the desire in that moment is to get the hell out of there, right? So that's the behavior. And maybe you don't, right? But maybe then you start to get a little bit more irritable with your partner or with people around, or maybe you just shut down and don't engage because it feels really uncomfortable. But your partner might see it as like you just being disengaged and not caring. So again, it's helpful to really break down each of the components of your anxiety to whoever you're explaining it to. You want to get really clear and explain to this other person, like, what are the triggers to your anxiety? Because they're very individualized. What might trigger your anxiety might be different than my anxiety or someone else. And if I have an anxiety disorder, it might be I really struggle more so like going with the social setting, but maybe I'm good in public speaking, right? So it just really depends, right? So getting really clear for you and explaining this to this other person that you're having this dialogue with these are the specific things that really kind of trigger my anxiety. And of course, recognizing that you might not know all of them. Some of them might come as a surprise as you're dealing with them in the moment, but you might generally have an idea. And the more you start exploring a relationship with anxiety, you're probably going to start noticing some patterns, right? So getting really clear on like, what type of anxiety do you struggle with? What are the things that will really start to trigger it? If you're someone that struggles with a specific phobia, let's say you have a phobia of dogs, then getting clear, like, is it just being around a dog, or is it seeing a dog on TV or on a movie? Again, being really clear with whoever you're having this discussion, what does really bring on this anxious response, so that they have an understanding if maybe you're, confronted with a situation where this trigger is showing up, that they kind of already have a heads up and know like, oh, okay, maybe this is why you're having a reaction, whether you're letting them know or not. Partner, whoever you're having this discussion with, what happens to you after you've had a moment of anxiety, right? So it's pretty common to really just feel worn out and drained and not have the capacity or energy for much else after you've had a moment of intense anxiety, regardless of how you handled it, meaning if you felt like you handled it well or not. I really find for a lot of my clients, they really need like a reset and just time to really recharge, and they can't really have too much activity at that point because it's just they're still kind of trying to get their system back to normal for them, right? Back to a sense of feeling calm. And so again, just being really clear, like what happens to you, and explaining that to your other partner, whoever you're talking to, because they might not get it. Again, they might see it's like, okay, what happened? You like killed it at this party, right? Let's stay with that example, but yet now you're home and you're like completely shut down, right? They might not get it. They might think like, oh, maybe you were really upset or mad or whatever the case is, right? So getting clear with whoever you're talking to, what happens to you after the fact. Also, if you feel like you didn't handle it so well, because that happens, we're humans, also getting clear what happens to you in your head or in your feelings when you start feeling like you didn't handle it well. So I often hear a lot of times clients feeling like really like, gosh, I'm so dumb, or man, that shouldn't have been difficult for me, or I can't believe I struggled with that, or gosh, I feel like a failure because I couldn't deal with that and now I'm feeling shameful. So again, getting clear on also if you feel like you didn't handle the trigger so well, then how are you feeling in that moment? Okay, so the next tip is getting really clear by providing examples in your life. So I think that's the other thing. People really understand by stories. And so if you can kind of provide specific examples of what this looks like in your life, past, whether it's a long time ago or maybe in the recent past, that's also going to be really helpful in you describing your anxiety to someone else, especially someone who doesn't struggle with it. So kind of have really clear examples of what that looks like for you. And again, going into, what does it look like for you in the moment when you start feeling like your mind is like racing and it's on a loop and you can't stop it, or you just find yourself continually going to the worst case scenario and being scared that something's going to happen. Or you just feel like there's this tightness in your chest and you can't move through it, and just the fear feels so overwhelming. So again, get pretty descriptive in what your anxiety looks like and the examples when it's shown up in your life, so that you can provide these examples to the person that you're talking to, so that they can again start to have a better understanding of what this looks like for you. All right, next tip, be very clear that this isn't just you like stressing out or freaking out and you just can't get over it, right? So in other words, be clear that this is a disorder. This is something that you struggle with, right? There's anxiety disorder, right? Whether it's generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, right? Panic disorder, whatever the case is getting really clear with whoever you're talking that this is an actual medical disorder, right? That's why there's counseling and treatment for it. And so I think what's really important when you're having this discussion with someone, because I think a common tendency, not that people mean to be invalidating or mean, but sometimes people just are like, well, get over it, or just stop overthinking it. Well, yeah, if only it were that easy. And so it's just being really clear when you're talking to someone that this is a disorder that's persistent and has been consistent in your life, and that it really at times shows up and you struggle with it, right? That it causes interference in your life in ways that maybe, again, they don't understand, but hopefully at this point they're having a better understanding because you've provided examples of what that looks like to them, right? And a caveat with this, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that you are your anxiety or your anxiety is part of your identity. Like I mentioned before, it's helpful to have information to empower yourself. And I find a lot of times clients feel kind of validated in knowing that, but you want to be clear and not cross over the line in terms of like that anxiety becomes an end all be all of who you are, right? And then it starts to become part of your identity, and that you can't feel like you can do things because, your anxiety is showing up and that's just who you are. So again, it's being clear on, yes, this is a disorder. And so letting people know that so that they don't invalidate like, okay, we'll just get over it. It's not that easy. But again, that you know that of course you're not over identifying with it. All right, so the last tip is being really clear that maybe what they see is not the whole picture, right? So again, at this point, you've explained what your anxiety looks like. You've provided examples. You've provided understanding of what it looks like for you after an anxiety-provoking situation, as well as the triggers, but also being very clear that what they see might not be the full picture, right? So a lot of times, maybe they just might see like irritability, or you shutting down, or you avoiding, or you not wanting to do certain things that they want you to do. And so again, they only see a portion of what's going on. They don't see what's happening underneath, right? And so it's really clear that you at this point have made it clear, like, yes, all these symptoms that you might see, irritability, maybe at times short temper, feeling tense, maybe being a little bit more reactive at times, that's part of the picture, but it's not the whole thing, right? Because again, especially if you haven't explained your anxiety to someone, they might not be looking at it that way. They might be just construing it as like, oh, you're upset or frustrated or whatever the case is. So a lot of times being really clear that when they're seeing something, like only certain symptoms, they're not getting the full picture. Hopefully at this point, now that you've explained it, next time you have an instance, you can kind of clarify, like, you know, if you're irritable, you're tense, or you're short. And again, not to say that that's not something you can learn to manage and work through, but again, that they then have a better picture of, it's not even really about them. It's something that you're struggling with. You're having a moment of anxiety or something's coming up for you. So I think that's the other part, is getting really clear on like, it's not just what's observable from their eyes, but what's happening for you inside is much different. All right, guys, for more mental health content, subscribe to my email newsletter to get the latest updates on all anxiety-related content. And as always, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul. Thanks.